I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today I'm talking about Matt Ehret and Cynthia Chung, who are the co-founders of the Rising Tide Foundation in Canada. They're also the co-authors of a just completed trilogy called The Clash of the Two Americas. And they are husband and wife, the dynamic duo of deep state politics, operating and unraveling all of the intrigue in the global Gotham City from their book-lined batcave in Montreal. Today we're going to be looking at why we are sleepwalking into fascism, and why we should unplug and read a book, and also the connections between the CIA and modern art, and then why it is that meaning and poetry is so important to statesmanship. Let's get started. The Rising Tide Foundation states that it's dedicated to enhancing the cross-cultural understanding between East and West and opening that dialogue. This has meant a deeper dive into deep state politics than I have ever experienced before. And I am a conspiracy buff. I thought I already knew a lot. Cynthia has just completed part 5 of her Sleepwalking into Fascism series, and she writes, "Thus far in this series, we have seen a picture that has painted NATO, the CIA, and fascists, including outright Nazis, all working for the same apparatus and essentially the same goal: to overthrow democratically elected leaders and replace them with dictators and fascist right-wing governments. In part 4, it was discussed how the profits of the narcotics trade are used in turn to fund right-wing terrorist activity globally, using the model of NATO's Gladio. The great heroin coup by the CIA and company was about having complete control over the profits of heroin for this very purpose." In part 5, she quotes Bertrand Russell and how you need to have mass psychology in order to convince people that snow is black, in order to get them to see the opposite of what's in front of their eyes. And so he says that you need to start before age 10, that it's really good to put your propaganda to a catchy tune, and that you need to ridicule people who still say that snow is white. So she shows how the CIA-NATO agenda has been consistent for the last 77 years, going into what's happening now in Ukraine. There are a lot of people, including the US media, who will argue with their conclusions, who will tell you that snow is black, that Nazis aren't really Nazis anymore. But what they can't argue with are the direct quotes and the data that they bring to the picture. Every time that they speak volumes, and they have volumes that back up everything that they say. Matt has another series on the untold history of Canada, which makes him the Northern Howard Zinn. He's also a senior fellow at the American University of Moscow, and he's an expert on the China-Russia collaboration of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the new Silk Road. So it's really good, especially at this time when our information from Russia and China is being blocked, to have someone who's a witness that that kind of collaboration is possible. Blogging as Canadian Patriot 1776, Matt often chronicles the near misses, the deflection points, the places where history could have gone a different way, like when the initial colonies differentiated into being Canada and the United States, and how that could have turned into something that would have meant collaboration between the East and the West, and the development of all the places in between. And Matt Ehret knows how to read. As John Taylor Gatto, the author of Dumbing Us Down, and someone who I think Matt would like if he's not already familiar with him, as he has said, Matt knows how to read for power. That one time Matt related that he was working in a university library and they were getting rid of all their books because they said, oh, they're all in digital form anyway. And so he hauled back volumes of the complete works of Lincoln, of Ben Franklin, of Erasmus. And so that's what's in his book line, Batcave Now. While Matt sees the internet as an unparalleled tool for research and for communication, he also says that it's a tool for the destruction of the mind, because we need that unbroken focus of being unplugged and reading a book and being able to think. Matt was studying at one point for art, and what he found was that they told him that, oh, if you can tell what your painting is trying to convey, it's not a good painting. That's not really art. It has to be inscrutable. It has to have no meaning whatsoever that anyone could discern. And that made no sense to him, and so he changed what he was studying. In one of his interviews, Matt talks about how 9/11 was his wake-up call. And the same was true for me. What it showed me was that there was nothing that they wouldn't do. And there was nothing that they couldn't get away with. And in a sense, I believe that the bigger a lie is, the easier it is for people to dismiss it because of their own cognitive dissonance. And so for Matt and myself, I think this has made it easier for us to see the evidence. One of those unthinkable rocks that Matt has turned over lately has been looking at the attacks in Buffalo and lately in Texas. Amid the calls for greater surveillance and censorship and gun laws, what Matt reports on is a study done in 2012 by the Center for National Security at Fordham Law School. And he writes, in this course of its investigation, researchers at Fordham discovered that every single one of the 138 terrorist incidents recorded in the USA between 2001 and 2012 involved FBI informants who played leading roles in planning out, supplying weapons, instructions, and even recruiting Islamic terrorists to carry out terrorist acts on U.S. soil. For me, one of my first hints that Amy Goodman was not skeptical enough was when they were reporting on the Newburgh Four. And that was a trial where even the judge determined that they had been set up by the FBI. But she said, well, and next door in the next courtroom, there's a real terrorist who's being tried. That turned out to be the Times Square bomber who conveniently left his wallet in the car with the bomb when he abandoned it. And then I remember the underwear bomber and researching that, and that he was a kid who was ushered through security with no luggage and no coat, and that according to other passengers, he seemed to be dazed or drugged. And then there was the package that was addressed to a Jewish temple that contained a bomb, but they had to look twice through every package that was in their storage before they found where they had hidden it. But conveniently, that had the sender's real return address on it. So once you know that there is nothing that they wouldn't do, it becomes much easier to put together these pieces. When Matt talked about his experience in art school, where art was supposed to be meaningless, that rang bells for me, that somewhere I had heard that that was a plot. And so I contacted my favorite conspiracy theorist and artist, Ernest, who posts under the Electric Mule on my YouTube channel. And sure enough, he sent me a wealth of articles. So one of them is how the CIA funded and supported literary magazines worldwide while waging cultural war against communism. It states, the CIA developed several guises to throw money at young, burgeoning writers, creating a cultural propaganda strategy with literary outposts around the world, from Lebanon to Uganda, India to Latin America. It funded, organized, and curated them with the full knowledge of editors like Paris Review co-founder Peter Mathiasson, himself a CIA agent. In JSTOR Daily, Lucy Levine published an article called "Was Modern Art a CIA PSYOPs?" She concludes that it was, but seems to think that was a good thing. She writes, "It was precisely because modern art was not universally popular and was created by artists who openly disdained orthodoxy that it was such an effective tool in showcasing the fruits of American cultural freedom to anyone looking in from abroad. President Truman personally considered modern art merely the vaporings of half-baked lazy people. But he did not declare it degenerate and expel its practitioners to gulags in Siberia. Not only that, abstract expressionism in particular was a direct repudiation of Soviet socialist realism. Nelson Rockefeller liked to call it free enterprise painting. In contrast to the Soviet Union's Popular Front, the New Yorker magazine wonderfully and perfectly referred to the political role of American modernism as the unpopular front. The very existence of American modern art proved to the world that its creators were free to create whether you liked their work or not." Along with the articles, Ernest sent me a funny story about being in a Paris restaurant in the 70s with other video artists and the curator of a particularly prestigious Amsterdam museum. And rabble-rouser that he is, he brought up an article that had been published in '67 in the New York Review of Books called "The CIA and the Intellectuals," that talked about how all of modern art was really this PSYOPs program. And there was someone there who was the director of the American Cultural Center and who also was an American diplomat, and he confirmed that it was all true. So at that point, the curator started sputtering and saying, "No, we have abstract expressionism and pop art in our museum because it's quality." And the rest of them started teasing her and saying, "No, it's not necessarily great. You just think it's great because the U.S. government told you that it was great, and you Europeans are naive enough to believe it." So she ended up being taken aback and shocked, and Ernest, of course, had great fun with it. And he told me this in dead earnest as an unrepentant punster. But the story I had really been looking for, I found that Matt himself had written. And so that is "Why Must Aesthetics Govern a Society Worthy of Political Freedom?" Ask the CIA. He writes, "Many were startled by the revelation that the entire evolution of 20th century modern art was directed in large measure by the CIA. This not only included the direct financing of abstract painters like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko, whose work now regularly sells for over $100 million apiece, but also powerful literary magazines like Salon and Encounter, interpretive dance schools, and the remarkably ugly atonal music of Arnold Schoenberg." The Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF, funded in 1950 by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, was headed by Bertrand Russell, who continued his thoughts on mass psychology by saying, "Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part. It may be hoped that in time anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment." Note that he uses the term patient. So Matt's suspicion was right, and pointlessness is the point. They want to show us that there is no meaning, not to family, to education, to art, to life. And so what Matthew and Cynthia are doing with the Rising Tide Foundation is bringing meaning back by separating the lies and the truth in history and also looking to ancient philosophers and poets, one of whom is Shelley. They've looked at his hymn to intellectual beauty. In Cynthia's essay, Why the Poetic Principle is Imperative for Statecraft, she quotes Shelley that poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. The word hierophant is one that I first encountered in my Crow Tarot deck, where typically it means looking at traditional answers and authority, but what it actually means is someone who's an interpreter of the sacred mysteries, who dives into the subconscious and brings back those truths that are things that belong to all of us. And so it comes from tahira, which is the holy, and fanin, which is to show. So I think of holiness as being a state of oneness, as being making whole, which is also the meaning of healing. Because of Cynthia and Matthew, my understanding of what is the reality in the world is more whole, is more holy. And I think that that can only lead to a world that is more healed. I'm glad to be on this journey with them. As anyone who's watched my videos knows, I have plenty of material on conspiracy theories, but I think that it's important to alternate between the reality in the world and the reality of the world. So here's one that is on Daniel Pinchbeck called In the Context of All Being One, and here's one on Marianne Williamson called Spiritual Optimism and Political Radicalism. And thank you for watching. I hope that you subscribe and check out my text version on Substack under Third Paradigm. Thank you.